The trip started out as a much-needed escape. Work had been dragging me down for months, and I couldn't take the monotony of waking up every day just to stare at a computer screen for hours on end. So, when I finally got a long weekend, I decided to go solo camping in the national forest about 3 hours from home. It wasn't my first time camping alone. I've always found something calming about the isolation of it, the simplicity of life in the woods, away from the constant noise of the city. No texts, no emails, just quiet. I packed light but made sure I had everything essential. My tent, sleeping bag, food for a couple of days, my trusty camping stove, a water filter, and a small first aid kit. My knife and a small hatchet were in the side pocket of my backpack, and I carried a headlamp with extra batteries. I left early Friday morning, hoping to get to my campsite before noon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a light breeze, not too hot. The drive up was uneventful, the roads mostly empty, and by the time I turned off the main highway onto the gravel road that led into the woods, I was already feeling more relaxed. The forest was dense, with tall pines stretching endlessly in every direction. The road narrowed as I drove deeper in, the trees pressing close on either side. My campsite was about 2 miles from the trailhead, near a small lake. It wasn't an official campground, but I'd found it a year ago on another trip. Back then, it had been perfect, quiet, secluded, with a flat spot for my tent and easy access to the water. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail was familiar, winding gently uphill through the trees. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was high overhead. I set up my tent in the same spot as before, on a flat patch of ground a few yards from the lake. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and I could already feel the tension draining from my body. After setting up camp, I sat on a rock by the lake, eating a sandwich and watching the water. There was no one else around, just me, the trees, and the occasional bird. The afternoon passed quickly. I spent some time gathering firewood, then walked down to the lake and filtered some water to refill my bottles. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. A simple meal of instant noodles and canned tuna. Not gourmet, but it tasted damn good after a day of hiking and setting up camp. By the time the sky turned pink and orange, I was feeling content and a little drowsy. The woods around me were peaceful, the air cool and still. Then I heard it, a soft sound, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, a rustling in the bushes behind me. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was deliberate, slow. I turned, peering into the shadows. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond its circle of warmth, the forest was dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The hair on the back of my neck standing up, a sudden tightness in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I added more wood to the fire, the flames flaring up, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. The woods are full of noises, especially at night. I'd spent enough time camping to know that. Still, I kept my knife within reach as I climbed into my tent and zipped it shut. The forest was quiet now, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the tent's ceiling, my ears straining for any hint of movement. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, heart pounding with no idea why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow through the tent walls. The forest was pitch black, the air cold and still. I lay there, holding my breath, listening, and then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate footsteps. They were close, too close. My mind raced. It had to be another camper, someone who had stumbled onto my sight by accident. But it was the middle of the night, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. I reached for my knife, my hand trembling. The footsteps stopped, just outside the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast in the silence. I gripped the knife tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then the tent zipper started to move. Slowly, I froze. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The zipper stopped halfway down, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then a hand reached inside. It was dark, but I could see the outline of it. A pale hand, the fingers long and thin. It fumbled for a moment, then grabbed the edge of the tent and pulled it open wider. I reacted without thinking. I lashed out with the knife, the blade slicing through the air. The hand jerked back, and there was a sharp cry, a man's voice, filled with pain and surprise. I scrambled out of the tent, the knife still in my hand. My eyes darted around, searching for whoever or whatever had been there, but there was no one, just the dark woods and the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the trees. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was he? What did he want? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and started running back toward the trailhead. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made me flinch, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, but I didn't dare stop. I kept moving, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint outline of my car through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down until I was inside, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, the lights of a gas station glowing like a beacon in the distance. I pulled in, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for a long time, trying to calm my breathing. It wasn't until I saw the blood on my knife, the thin smear of red along the blade, that it really sank in. Whoever he was, I'd hurt him. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. I called the local rangers the next morning and reported the incident, but they didn't find anyone. No tracks, no blood, nothing. I haven't been back to that campsite since. Maybe it was just some crazy guy, someone looking for trouble. Or maybe it was something worse. Either way, I'm done with solo camping. Some things just aren't worth the risk. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in the wilderness that felt so peaceful, so raw. It was me and a couple of close friends, a weekend getaway to escape the hustle of everyday life. None of us were experts in outdoor survival or anything, but we knew enough to get by. Setting up tents, building a fire, cooking over an open flame. That was all we needed to enjoy ourselves. We had decided on a spot a little further off the beaten path this time, a quiet corner of the forest where we'd been before but hadn't explored much. It was a bit more remote than usual, but we were up for it. We packed our gear into the truck, hit the road, and before long, we were far enough out of town that the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. After an hour or so of driving along narrow dirt roads, we finally reached the clearing. It was perfect, a flat patch of grass surrounded by tall, dense trees. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting patterns on the ground that looked almost like a welcome sign. We unloaded our things, set up camp, and started the fire. The first few hours were full of easy conversation, laughter, and the smell of food cooking over the flames. It felt just like any other camping trip. But something was different this time. As night began to fall, the mood shifted. I noticed it first, but didn't think much of it at the time. It was like the air itself was thicker, heavier. The shadows cast by the fire seemed longer, stretching into the trees in ways they shouldn't have. I shrugged it off, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the chill in the air as it started to cool down. We settled in around the campfire, our voices growing softer as the sky darkened. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, seemed quieter. It was almost as if the whole world had gone still, the kind of quiet that made you aware of how loud your own thoughts were. "Anyone want another drink?" I asked, reaching for my cooler. There was no answer. At first, I thought they hadn't heard me. I glanced over at my friends, but none of them seemed to be paying attention. They were staring into the trees, faces turned in the direction of the woods beyond the firelight. "Guys," I said again, a little louder this time. One of them, Mark, finally turned to me, his face pale. He didn't look scared exactly, just off. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" "I don't know. Something. It's not right." I was about to laugh it off, but then I heard it too. It was faint at first, but there was a sound coming from the woods, like a twig snapping, followed by something heavy, like something large moving through the brush. My eyes darted over to the trees, straining to see anything through the shadows. But there was nothing there. "Probably just a deer or something," I said, trying to calm the group. But even as I spoke, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The sound came again, a little closer this time. Another twig snapping, followed by a long, drawn-out rustle. "Okay, now I'm freaking out a little." "Emma," one of my friends said. She leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "That's not a deer. That's too big." We all fell silent, listening. I felt my heartbeat pick up, the sudden tension in the air suffocating. Whatever it was big, and it was moving toward us. The sound continued, closer now, but it wasn't coming from the direction of the forest. It was coming from behind us. Slowly, the realization hit me. The trees were too dense in the direction we'd set up camp for anything to be moving through them that easily. Whatever this was, it wasn't an animal. Suddenly, there was a thud, a heavy, deliberate thud, like something had dropped onto the ground with purpose. Then silence. I looked around at the others. Mark and Emma were staring at the dark edge of the clearing, their faces tense. None of us spoke. We just listened, waiting for the next noise. I kept thinking it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the unease in my gut kept growing. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "This is getting weird. Let's just check it out. It's probably nothing." I grabbed a flashlight from my backpack, stood up, and slowly walked toward the edge of the clearing, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness in front of me, but it didn't reveal anything unusual, just trees and shadows and nothing moving. I stepped a little further, and that's when I saw it. A small object in the dirt, half hidden by the brush. It looked like it had been dropped recently. I bent down to get a better look, and my stomach twisted. It was a bloody bandage. It was old, but the stain was fresh. I stood up quickly, a cold shiver running down my spine. The air felt different now, colder, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I turned around to head back to the campfire, but before I could move, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching the underbrush, just out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I ran back toward the camp, shouting for the others to pack up. "Get the stuff, now!" "We need to go," I yelled as I burst into the clearing. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They saw the panic in my eyes and immediately started grabbing their things. We were all in motion, running on pure instinct, trying to get the tents packed and the fire put out. But it was too late. The sound of footsteps, slow, heavy steps, grew louder behind us. I grabbed my backpack, not even bothering to make sure I had everything, and we all took off, running toward the truck. The sound of whatever it was chasing us wasn't far behind. We reached the truck in a panic, fumbling with the keys, almost dropping them. I finally got the door open and shoved the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, but I didn't wait to let it warm up. I slammed the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward, kicking up dust and gravel as we sped down the dirt road. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following us. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind us, stretching into the distance. We didn't talk much on the way back. The silence between us was thick with the tension of what had happened. We all knew something wasn't right out there, but none of us could put our finger on what. There were no clear signs, no footprints, no tracks, nothing that would explain what we heard or what we felt. But one thing was certain, we were never going back there. It started as a quick weekend camping trip. Just me, my backpack, and enough gear to last a couple of days. I needed some time away from everything. The noise, the stress, the endless cycle of work and routines. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a quiet escape into the woods. I'd done this before plenty of times. The plan was simple: hike up to Ridge Hollow, camp near the stream, and head back the next afternoon. Ridge Hollow is a remote spot, barely marked on most trail maps, but known among hikers for its clear waters and thick pine cover. It's peaceful. No cell service, no people. Exactly what I needed. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well worn, winding steadily upward through a mix of hardwoods and dense brush. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. I felt good. I reached Ridge Hollow around noon, set up camp, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. The stream was cold and clean, cutting through the valley in a series of shallow pools and moss-covered rocks. I filled my water bottles and sat for a while, just listening to the water move. As evening crept in, the air grew cooler, and shadows stretched long across the ground. I built a small fire, cooked some instant noodles, and watched the sky turn dark. It was the kind of darkness you don't get in the city, deep and absolute. I crawled into my tent early, exhausted from the hike. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I fell asleep quickly. I'm not sure what woke me up. One second I was dead asleep, and the next I was wide awake, my heart racing. I lay there listening. First there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it, a faint crunch like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be anything small. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The steps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds, as if whoever or whatever it was listening. My skin prickled. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to illuminate the immediate area. Nothing, no movement, no shapes in the darkness. For a long time, I just sat there, flashlight in hand, waiting. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, and the forest went quiet again. I told myself it was just my imagination, zipped the tent back up, and tried to sleep. I woke up late, the sun already high in the sky. For a moment, I'd almost convinced myself the footsteps had been a dream. But when I stepped out of the tent, I noticed something strange. My pack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, was lying on the ground several feet away. I checked the contents. Nothing was missing, but it had clearly been moved. The straps were unbuckled, and some of the gear inside was scattered. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I scanned the surrounding area, looking for tracks or any sign of who might have been there, but the ground was too covered in leaves to tell. I debated packing up and heading back right then, but I'd come all this way, and it felt silly to leave over a few weird noises. I convinced myself it was probably another hiker messing around or maybe an animal that got curious. I decided to stay. I spent most of the day fishing and walking along the stream, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was dipping below the ridge. I rebuilt the fire, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. But as the light faded, that feeling crept back. The sense that I wasn't alone. I stayed up late, sitting by the fire, listening. The forest felt different, too quiet, too still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. Slow, steady, circling the edge of the campsite. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and stood by the fire, trying to look calm, trying not to let fear take over. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No response. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the silence was worse than the sound itself. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees, but all I saw was darkness. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, every nerve on edge, jumping at every sound. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and started back down the trail. I didn't care how tired I was. I just wanted to be out of those woods. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. About halfway down, I found something that stopped me cold. A single boot print in the mud, right in the middle of the trail. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, pointing uphill, toward Ridge Hollow. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. There shouldn't have been anyone else up there. I hadn't seen a single soul the entire trip. I thought about the footsteps, the moved pack, the eerie silence, the feeling of being watched. I didn't stick around to think about it too long. I picked up the pace, practically jogging the rest of the way down. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, catching my breath. The forest seemed peaceful again in the daylight. Normal, almost like nothing had happened. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there with me, that they were still up there watching from the trees. I never went back to Ridge Hollow after that. I still go camping sometimes, but I stick to well-traveled trails and crowded campgrounds. And no matter where I go, I always make sure I'm not alone, because the scariest thing in the woods isn't a ghost or a monster. It's another person. I've always liked solo camping. Something about being alone in the middle of nowhere just feels right. I don't mind the quiet. Actually, I prefer it. No distractions, no expectations. Just me, the trees, and the sound of my boots crunching on dirt. That's the life. No schedule to follow except the sun rising and setting. I get to think clearly out here, away from the buzz of my phone, from work stress, and the endless noise of the world. I've done this plenty of times before, and I know how to handle myself. But this trip, this one was different. It started simple enough. I packed my gear, threw it into my truck, and drove out early on a Friday morning. I had my usual stuff: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, all the basics. I even brought a new knife I'd been itching to try out. The plan was to camp deep in a national forest that was pretty far off the beaten path. I'd found this spot on a hiking forum, a little-known trail that supposedly led to a beautiful, secluded lake. There wasn't much info about it, but that was part of the appeal. I liked going places most people didn't. The first few hours were smooth. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked in with my pack strapped tight to my back. The trail was narrow and a little overgrown, but nothing too rough. The weather was perfect, warm, with a light breeze cutting through the trees. I remember thinking it was going to be one of those peaceful trips I'd remember for years. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, stopping a couple of times to sip water and catch my breath. Around mid-afternoon, I found a nice spot to set up camp. It was a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, with a little stream trickling nearby. The sound of the water was calming, and the shade from the trees kept things cool. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, I was settled in, sitting by the fire with a cup of instant coffee in hand. The stars came out one by one, bright and clear without any city lights to wash them out. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The thing about camping alone is that you notice every sound. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes. It all stands out. Most of the time, it's nothing. A squirrel, a bird, the wind playing tricks on your ears. I'm used to it, but that night something felt off. Started small. A faint sound in the distance, like footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow and deliberate, heavy. At first, I told myself it was just a deer or maybe even a bear passing through. But then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I shook it off, poked at the fire with a stick, and tried to relax. Maybe I was just imagining things. It happens when you're alone in the woods at night. Your mind plays tricks on you. But a few minutes later, the sound came back. Closer this time. It was the kind of sound that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Footsteps, crunching through the leaves, slow and steady. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding strange and small in the vast quiet. No answer. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and the thick trunks of pine trees stretching into the dark. I told myself to calm down. There was nothing there. Maybe it was just the wind moving the branches. Or maybe I was being paranoid. Either way, I decided it was time to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. The fabric felt thin, like it wouldn't do much to protect me from anything, but it was better than nothing. I laid down on my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and listened to the sound of the stream. I don't know how long I lay there, wide awake, before I heard it again. Footsteps. Close. Too close. My heart was pounding now, loud in my ears. I gripped my knife, my fingers tightening around the handle. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight this time. If someone or something was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 1 minute, 2, 5, still nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I remember is waking up to sunlight filtering through the tent. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I stepped out of the tent, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They circled my tent and led off into the woods. My stomach dropped. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. Whoever it was had been right outside my tent while I slept. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my pack without bothering to fold it neatly. My hands were shaking as I doused the fire pit and strapped the pack to my back. I needed to get out of there. The trail felt different on the way back. The trees seemed thicker, the shadows darker. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail was empty, just me and the woods. I pushed myself hard, barely stopping to catch my breath. By the time I reached the trailhead and saw my truck, my legs were burning, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road. I didn't look back. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, about how they had circled my tent, about how whoever it was had disappeared without a trace. When I got home, I locked every door and window, pulled the blinds shut, and sat on the couch with my knife still in my hand. I don't camp alone anymore. Not after that. Whatever or whoever was out there that night, I don't want to meet them again. I love camping. I've done it countless times. Sometimes solo, sometimes with friends. The isolation, the fresh air, the quiet, there's nothing quite like it. I thought I was prepared for everything the wilderness could throw at me. I was wrong. This story isn't about some ghost or creature lurking in the woods. It's about something far more real and far more terrifying. It started with a weekend trip to a place called Devil's Ridge. A little dramatic for a name, sure, but it was remote, and that's what I wanted, complete solitude for a couple of days. I had just finished a brutal few weeks at work and needed some peace and quiet. No phone, no emails, no people. Just me, the trees, and my tent. I packed light but smart, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, plenty of water, a knife, a first aid kit, a headlamp, and my reliable old hiking boots. My phone was fully charged, but there wouldn't be any service out there. I didn't mind. The less connected I was, the better. The drive out took about 4 hours. The last hour was a bumpy dirt road that wound its way up into the mountains. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The sky was clear, and the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and set off down the trail. The plan was to hike about 5 miles in, set up camp near a small creek I'd marked on my map, and spend the weekend exploring the area. The trail was well-worn but empty. No other hikers in sight. Perfect. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. After about an hour, I reached the creek. It was exactly as I'd imagined. Clear, cold water running over smooth rocks, surrounded by tall pines. I found a flat spot a few yards from the water and set up camp. The air was cool, but not cold. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nose. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. Dinner was simple, dehydrated chili and a granola bar. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet and the crackle of the fire. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the shadows deepened and the forest grew dark. I watched the fire until it burned down to embers, then crawled into my tent. I zipped up my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. I woke up to the sound of something snapping in the woods, a branch maybe 20 yards away. My eyes shot open. It was pitch black inside the tent, and for a moment I wasn't sure where I was. Then it came back to me, Devil's Ridge, the creek, the tent. I listened, holding my breath. Crunch. Another sound. Closer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. I've been in the woods enough to know what a deer or a raccoon sounds like. This was different. Heavy. Human. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably another camper. Maybe they'd lost the trail and were trying to find their way back. But something about the way the footsteps moved didn't feel right. They were too slow, too careful. I reached for my headlamp and clicked it on. The inside of the tent lit up, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thin fabric. The footsteps had stopped. The only sound was the creak, gurgling softly in the dark. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd been out here all day without seeing a single soul. What were the chances someone would just happen to stumble across my camp in the middle of the night? I took a deep breath, turned off the headlamp, and lay back down. I didn't sleep. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the forest looked almost friendly in the daylight. I told myself the footsteps had just been my imagination. Maybe a tree branch falling, or some animal I didn't recognize. I spent the day hiking and exploring the area. I found an old logging road that hadn't been used in years, followed it for a while, then looped back toward camp. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look around, but there was never anyone there, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd spooked myself the night before and was jumping at shadows. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I built another fire, boiled some water for instant noodles, and tried to relax. As the sun set, the unease returned. The shadows grew longer, and the friendly forest from earlier in the day turned dark and silent. I kept the fire going longer than usual, feeding it stick after stick until I had a roaring blaze. I sat with my back to the tent, facing the woods, listening. Nothing. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers. I considered staying up all night, but I was exhausted. I crawled into the tent, leaving the headlamp on this time. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I woke up to the sound of footsteps again, closer this time. My heart was pounding in my chest. I sat up, gripping the knife I'd left next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. A faint rustling sound. Someone or something was brushing against the side of the tent. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. My mind was racing. What the hell was I supposed to do? Burst out of the tent and confront whoever was out there? Stay inside and hope they went away? The rustling stopped. The footsteps started again, moving away from the tent, back toward the woods. I waited, counting the seconds. 10, 20, 30. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside, knife in hand. The fire had burned down to ashes, and the forest was dark. My headlamp cast a narrow beam of light that barely pierced the shadows. There was no one there. I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. The forest was silent, watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. To first light, I packed up my gear. I wasn't sticking around to find out what or who had been outside my tent. I hiked back to the trailhead as fast as I could, my head on a swivel the whole time. Every snapping branch, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key and started the engine. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty road and the endless forest. It wasn't until I hit the highway that I started to feel safe again. Looking back, I don't know what really happened out there. Maybe it was just some random hiker who didn't realize how creepy they were being. Maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. What I do know is this: I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. I've always loved camping. It's a break from the usual noise of life, a way to disconnect and breathe in the calm of nature. It's just you, the woods, and the endless sky. That kind of peace isn't easy to find. But this trip was different. It didn't go as planned. In fact, it's the reason I don't camp alone anymore. It started on a Friday afternoon in late September. I had a few days off work and decided to head out to a spot I'd found online. Remote, quiet, perfect. The place was deep in a national forest about a 3-hour drive from my house. I packed light but smart. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water, a first aid kit, a knife, my headlamp, and some other essentials. The drive was easy enough, the sun hanging low but warm in the sky. I reached the trailhead around 4 p.m., parked my truck, and started hiking toward the campsite. The trail was narrow but well-marked, weaving through tall pines that seemed to stretch forever. Birds chirped lazily, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. The hike was supposed to be just under 2 miles. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I found a flat patch of ground near a small creek and set up camp. My tent went up quickly, and soon I had a fire crackling in front of me. I cooked a simple meal, just some instant noodles and beef jerky, and sat by the fire watching the flames dance. The night was cold but clear, stars spilling across the sky in every direction. There was no cell signal, no noise except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the gentle babble of the creek. It was exactly what I needed. I went to bed around 10 p.m., the fire reduced to glowing embers. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up tight, and listened to the night for a while. The forest seemed alive in a way it doesn't during the day. Crickets chirped in steady rhythm, and the creek gurgled softly. I drifted off quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. My headlamp was within reach, so I grabbed it and clicked it on, the narrow beam of light cutting through the dark. The tent walls glowed faintly in the beam. I listened, holding my breath. There was nothing, just the same soft sounds of the night. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal rustling in the leaves or a branch falling somewhere in the distance. Still, my heart was racing a little. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. Eventually, I turned the headlamp off and closed my eyes. I woke up to sunlight filtering through the tent walls. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that feels clean and sharp in your lungs. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The creek wound deeper into the woods, and I followed it for a while, hopping from rock to rock, taking my time. I found some animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe a raccoon, and a few wild berries that I knew weren't safe to eat. The woods felt even quieter during the day, peaceful in a way that almost felt unnatural. Around noon, I made my way back to camp and spent the afternoon reading a book I'd brought. The hours slipped by, the sun crawling slowly across the sky. I felt relaxed, more than I had in weeks. That evening, I built another fire and cooked some more food. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames until the stars came out again. I went to bed a little earlier that night, feeling pleasantly tired from the day. I fell asleep almost immediately, but once again, something woke me up. This time, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I lay there, perfectly still, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a sound outside the tent, soft but deliberate. Footsteps, not the random rustling of an animal or the creak of a tree. These were slow, steady steps circling the tent. I grabbed my headlamp and clicked it on, my hand trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I waited for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body tensed. Finally, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, shining the light in a wide arc. The forest was empty. I stepped out slowly, the beam of my headlamp sweeping across the trees. The fire had burned down to ash, leaving the campsite in near total darkness. The air was cold and still. I didn't see anything. No tracks, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. But I knew what I'd heard. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, scanning the woods, my breath visible in the cold night air. Then, reluctantly, I climbed back into the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little sound made me jump. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I debated packing up and heading home early, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness. I told myself it was just an animal, that I was overreacting. I spent most of the day around camp, gathering firewood, trying to keep busy. But the feeling of being watched never really left me. The sun set earlier than I expected, the sky turning orange and pink before fading to deep blue. I built another fire, but it felt less comforting than it had the nights before. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food, and went to bed as soon as the fire started to die down. I woke up again. This time it was different. The footsteps were back, but they weren't circling the tent. They were standing still right outside. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy. My pulse was thundering in my ears. I clutched my knife, my hands slick with sweat. Then, without warning, the tent shook violently, the fabric bulging inward as someone pushed against it. I shouted, slashing blindly with the knife. The blade tore through the fabric, and the pressure vanished. I scrambled out of the tent, knife in one hand, headlamp in the other. The campsite was empty, the fire pit cold and dark. My breath came in ragged gasps, my headlamp beam darting wildly through the trees. I didn't wait to find out what or who had been out there. I grabbed my backpack, leaving the tent and most of my gear behind, and started running. The trail was barely visible in the dark, but I didn't care. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the beam of my headlamp bouncing wildly. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. It took me almost an hour to reach the truck. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a gas station parking lot, watching the sky slowly lighten, the terror of the night still fresh in my mind. The next day, I drove back to the trailhead with a ranger. We hiked back to the campsite together. My tent was still there, the fabric ripped where I'd slashed it. Nothing else had been touched. My gear, my food, everything was exactly as I'd left it. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The ranger shrugged, told me it was probably a bear or maybe a prankster. But I knew better. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will. I've always liked camping. Something about being out in the wild, far away from everything, felt like hitting a reset button. Life gets loud, and I've found that nature is the only place quiet enough to clear my head. That's why I decided to go solo this time. No friends, no conversations, just me and the woods. I planned it out carefully, a 2-night trip in a remote area up north, far enough from the usual crowded campgrounds. I had my tent, a sturdy backpack full of supplies, and a mapped-out route that I studied for hours beforehand. I wasn't new to this kind of thing. I'd been camping since I was a teenager. I knew how to read maps, how to purify water, how to stay calm when things went sideways. Or at least I thought I did. Started out fine. The hike to my campsite was about 6 miles in, mostly uphill but manageable. I reached a clearing around 3 p.m., set up my tent, and made a small fire to boil some water for dinner. The air smelled clean, the trees whispered in the wind, and everything felt right. No phone service, no distractions, just how I liked it. The first night passed without incident. The wind picked up a bit after midnight, rustling the leaves outside, but nothing unusual. I woke up once to the sound of something moving through the underbrush, but I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging for food. After a few minutes, the noise stopped and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came and I felt refreshed. I brewed some coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a stream about half a mile from my camp, so I hiked down to refill my water bottles. The water was cold and clear, and the forest felt alive around me. Birds called from the treetops, squirrels darted through the branches, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. A shoe. It was lying near the edge of the stream, half buried in the mud. A men's hiking boot, scuffed and worn but still intact. It seemed out of place, too far from any trail, and there was no sign of its owner. I picked it up and looked around, but there was nothing else, just the boot. I set it back down and tried not to think too much about it. People lose things in the woods all the time, right? Maybe someone had passed through here months ago, lost their boot and kept going barefoot or with a spare. Still, it left an uneasy feeling in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I headed back to camp and spent the rest of the day sticking closer to my tent. I read a book, gathered some firewood, and tried to keep my mind busy. By the time the sun started to set, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, just a boot, no big deal. But that night, something changed. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it again, that sound in the underbrush. It was soft at first, like something brushing against the leaves. Then it grew louder, moving closer to my camp. I froze. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and slow, circling just outside the reach of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped the second the light hit the trees. I sat there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything over the crackling of the fire. The woods had gone completely silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed in my tent, clutching my knife, every sound making my heart race. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. Something wasn't right. I packed up my gear, doused the fire, and started back toward the trailhead. I tried to move quickly, but not so fast that I'd miss my footing. The trail felt different now, darker, quieter. About 3 miles in, I found something else. A campsite, or what was left of one. There was a collapsed tent, torn open at the front, with the fabric flapping in the wind. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered. Nearby, there was a backpack with its contents spilled across the ground. Clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight with dead batteries. No people, no signs of a struggle, just abandoned. My pulse quickened. I scanned the area, but there was nothing else. No boot prints, no blood, nothing to tell me what had happened here. I debated whether to search the surrounding area, but my gut told me to keep moving. The rest of the hike was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the empty trail, and my own footsteps echoing in the silence. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt like I could breathe again. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a while, just listening to the hum of the engine. I didn't see anyone else in the parking lot. I never did find out what happened at that campsite. I told a ranger about it when I got back to town, but he just nodded and said they'd check it out. Part of me wanted to press for answers, but another part of me was relieved to leave it behind. That night, back in my apartment, I lay in bed replaying everything in my head. The boot by the stream, the footsteps in the dark, the abandoned tent. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation for all of it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong out there in those woods, and I'm not sure I'll ever go camping alone again. Started out as a trip I'd been planning for weeks. I needed some time away, something to break the cycle of work and city noise. So, I packed up my gear, loaded my car, and headed out for a solo weekend camping trip in the remote Pine Ridge Forest. I had it all mapped out. 2 nights in the woods, away from everything. Just me, nature, and the sound of wind through the trees. Nothing but peace and quiet. The drive took about 4 hours, winding deeper into back roads that seemed to grow narrower the farther I went. My phone lost service long before I reached the trailhead, which didn't bother me. Honestly, I welcomed the disconnection. That's what I was looking for in the first place. No emails, no notifications, just pure, uninterrupted solitude. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead and hoisted my pack onto my shoulders. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, clean and fresh compared to the exhaust fumes of the city. The trail stretched out ahead of me, cutting through dense trees with patches of sunlight filtering through the branches. It was mid-afternoon when I set out, following the trail toward a small lake about 6 miles in. The hike was tougher than I expected, mostly uphill with a lot of loose rocks, but the landscape made up for it. The forest was beautiful, towering pines that seemed to scrape the sky, moss-covered logs, and the occasional stream trickling over smooth stones. About 3 hours later, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I imagined, more like a wide pond, but it was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it, and there wasn't another soul in sight. I found a flat spot a little ways back from the water and set up my tent. After that, I gathered some wood for a small fire, set up my camp chair, and sat down to take it all in. The first night was peaceful. I made a simple dinner over the fire, watched the sun set behind the trees, and listened to the distant calls of birds as the sky darkened. The stars were brighter than I'd seen in a long time, thousands of them scattered across the sky like someone had thrown glitter over a black sheet. I stayed up for a while, just staring at the fire and listening to the night. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle in the bushes or the distant hoot of an owl. Around 11 p.m., I finally crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and settled into my sleeping bag. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was pitch black, and it took me a second to get my bearings. I listened, trying to figure out what had woken me. There it was, a faint sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon sniffing around the camp. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't the kind of noise an animal would make. It sounded deliberate. Footsteps, not the light, quick steps of a 4-legged creature, but slow, steady footsteps. My heart started pounding in my chest. I lay completely still, barely breathing, straining to hear every sound. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the lake, moving closer to my tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They stopped just outside. I gripped the knife I always kept next to me when camping, my fingers tightening around the handle. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was another camper who'd gotten lost or someone from a nearby site, but deep down I knew that didn't make sense. I was miles away from the nearest campground, and I hadn't seen a single person since I left the car. The footsteps started again, circling the tent slowly. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric, but I could feel the presence just outside. Every muscle in my body was tense, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then it stopped. Silence. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. Nothing. No footsteps, no rustling. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, amplified by the darkness and isolation. I tried to convince myself it was an animal after all, maybe just curious and passing through. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked peaceful again, bathed in soft morning light, but the unease from the night before lingered. I checked around the tent for any signs of visitors, footprints, disturbed dirt, anything. The ground was hard-packed and covered in pine needles, so it was tough to tell, but I couldn't see anything obvious. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent most of the day exploring the area around the lake, trying to push the thoughts of last night out of my head. The hike was beautiful, and for a while it worked. I focused on the sound of the wind in the trees, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the sunlight glinting off the water. But every so often, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. By the time the sun started to set, I had almost convinced myself that I was being paranoid. I built another fire, made dinner, and tried to enjoy the evening. But as darkness fell, the forest felt different, heavier, like the trees were pressing in around me. The sounds of the night seemed louder, sharper. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made my skin prickle. I stayed up later than I had the night before, too nervous to go to sleep. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows around the campsite. Around midnight, I finally gave in, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. I crawled into the tent, knife by my side again, and closed my eyes. It didn't take long for the footsteps to return. This time, they were closer. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart racing. The footsteps were right outside the tent again, moving slowly, deliberately. Then something new, a sound I hadn't heard the night before. Breathing, slow, steady breathing. Whoever or whatever it was, they were standing just outside the tent, breathing heavily. I couldn't take it anymore. Gripping the knife tightly, I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. In one swift motion, I unzipped the tent and shined the beam outside. Nothing. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the empty space around my campsite. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I scanned the area, but there was no one there. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But I knew what I'd heard. I didn't wait until morning. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something emerging from the shadows. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to roll up my sleeping bag. By the time I hit the trail, it was almost 2 a.m. The forest was pitch black, the only light coming from my headlamp. Every step felt like it echoed through the trees, too loud in the silence. I kept moving, pushing myself to go faster despite the weight of my pack and the uneven terrain. My heart pounded in my chest, and every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. It felt like something was following me, staying just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I didn't relax until I was back on the main road, miles away from the forest. Only then did I pull over, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and try to catch my breath. To this day, I have no idea what happened out there. Maybe it was a person, some stranger wandering the woods in the middle of the night for reasons I'll never understand. Or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, twisting the normal sounds of the forest into something sinister. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never camp alone again. I wasn't expecting anything crazy when I planned the weekend trip. It was supposed to be simple. 2 nights in the mountains, just me and nature. It was late September, and the air was already turning crisp. The forecast promised clear skies, perfect camping weather. I wanted a break from my routine, something to clear my head for a while. I packed light, just the basics. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, a flashlight, extra batteries. enough food for 2 days and plenty of water. I threw in a knife, a small first aid kit, and my phone, fully charged. I wasn't going too deep into the wilderness, maybe 5 miles from the main trailhead, but it was far enough to feel isolated. That's what I wanted: quiet, peace, and time to think. The drive up was uneventful. The sun was shining through the trees as I wound my way up the gravel road toward the trailhead. I parked my car, double-checked my gear, and set off on the trail around noon. The forest was beautiful, dense with towering pines and thick underbrush. I could hear birds chirping and the wind whistling softly through the branches. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. About an hour into the hike, I veered off the main trail onto a smaller, less used path. I'd read about a good camping spot near a small stream, and I was determined to find it. The trail was narrow, almost overgrown in places, but the air smelled fresh, and the leaves crunched under my boots. I felt completely alone. No distant voices, no hum of cars, just the forest. By mid-afternoon, I found the spot. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with the stream just a few steps away. The water was clear and cold, the kind you could drink straight from if you had to. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to hear the water but far enough that it wouldn't keep me awake. Once my camp was ready, I sat down on a log, pulled out a granola bar, and just listened. The forest had this hum to it, a mix of wind, water, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to remember the last time I felt that calm, but nothing came to mind. I spent the afternoon gathering some firewood, nothing too serious, just enough to cook dinner and stay warm for a while. As the sun dipped lower, I lit a small fire and boiled some water for my dehydrated meal. Beef stew, not exactly gourmet, but after a day of hiking, it tasted amazing. By the time I finished eating, the light was fading fast. I leaned back against the log and watched the sky turn from orange to deep blue, then black. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like glitter. I could barely see my hand in front of my face without the firelight. That's how dark it got out there. I threw a few more logs on the fire and stayed up for a while, enjoying the warmth and the sound of the crackling wood. Eventually, though, the long day caught up with me. I doused the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest outside was quiet except for the sound of the stream. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remember is waking up to something outside. First, I thought it was the wind. I lay there listening, half asleep, but the sound didn't stop. It was a steady crunch, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. Not fast, not hurried, just walking. I held my breath, straining to hear. My heart started to race, pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My flashlight was next to me, and I grabbed it with a shaky hand. I waited for a moment, listening. The footsteps stopped. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it at the tent wall. Nothing, just the thin fabric glowing in the light. I took a deep breath and told myself to relax. Maybe it really was just an animal passing through. But then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure what to do. Yelling seemed like a bad idea. If it was an animal, it might scare it off, but if it wasn't, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight lit up the clearing, casting long shadows across the ground. I swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The trees looked taller and darker in the dim light, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. They weren't moving, just standing there, barely visible in the shadows. My pulse skyrocketed. I couldn't make out their face, just the outline of a person, tall and still. "Hello!" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. I felt my stomach tighten. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay quiet, to stay hidden, but I couldn't just sit there. I had to know who or what was out there. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in one hand, my knife in the other. The air was cold against my skin, and I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. I walked slowly toward the figure, keeping the light trained on them. "Who are you?" I said, louder this time. They turned and walked away. No hurry, no panic, just turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what just happened. My hands were shaking. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I wanted to chase after them, but something told me not to. Something about the way they moved, the way they didn't even glance back, it wasn't right. I backed away slowly, keeping the light on the trees. I didn't turn my back until I was inside the tent with the zipper closed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell was that? Why were they just standing there? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. It all felt like footsteps. I kept the knife in my hand, ready for whatever came next. But nothing happened. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just stuffed everything into my bag and started back down the trail. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every step, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure again. But the trail was empty. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away from the trailhead, back on the main road. I haven't been camping since. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I think about it. I can still see the outline of that figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to wander off the trail. I've always liked being outdoors. There's something about the way the trees sway gently in the wind and how the sound of leaves crunching underfoot feels like a kind of music. Hiking has been a hobby of mine for years, ever since I was a teenager. I usually stick to well-marked trails, but every once in a while, I get the urge to push myself a little further, to go somewhere more remote. That's how I found myself on a solo trip deep in the national forest last September. It was supposed to be a 2-day hike out and back. I'd mapped it all out beforehand. 10 miles in the first day, camp overnight, then 10 miles back the next. The area wasn't well traveled, but it wasn't completely off the grid either. I figured I'd have some peace and quiet, but still be within a reasonable distance of help if anything went wrong. I packed light, but made sure to bring all the essentials: water, food, first aid kit, extra layers, and my GPS. I started the hike early in the morning. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well maintained, and the air was cool and crisp. I passed through groves of pine trees, their scent sharp and clean. Birds called from the treetops, and I felt relaxed, almost serene. After about 3 hours, the trail narrowed and became less distinct. The dirt path was covered in leaves, and I had to pay close attention to avoid losing it. My GPS confirmed I was still on course, so I pressed on. By midday, I reached a clearing where I decided to take a break. I dropped my pack, sat on a fallen log, and pulled out a protein bar. The sun was warm on my face, and the quiet around me was almost too perfect. I checked my map and saw that I was right on schedule. Another few miles, and I'd reach a small stream where I planned to set up camp for the night. The next stretch of trail was tougher. It climbed steeply up a ridge, and the footing was uneven. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and I had to grab onto tree roots at times to steady myself. My legs burned with the effort, but the thought of reaching the stream kept me going. When I finally made it to the top of the ridge, I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. The forest stretched out below me, an endless sea of green. It was beautiful, but there was something about the vastness of it that felt unsettling. I shook off the feeling and started down the other side. That's when things started to go wrong. The trail disappeared. 1 minute, I was following a narrow path through the trees. The next, I was standing in the middle of the forest with no clear direction. I pulled out my GPS again, but the screen was blank. I tapped it, shook it, but nothing happened. The battery was dead. I cursed under my breath. I'd charged it the night before, and it should have lasted the whole trip. No big deal, I thought. I still had my map and compass. I just have to navigate the old-fashioned way. I unfolded the map and tried to match it to the landscape around me, but nothing looked quite right. The trees all seemed the same, and the ridge I just descended wasn't marked where I thought it should be. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. It's just the woods, I told myself. You're not lost. Not really. Just disoriented. I picked a direction that I thought would lead me back toward the trail and started walking. After about 20 minutes, I still hadn't found it. The trees grew denser, their branches closing in overhead and blocking out the sunlight. The ground was soft and spongy with moss, and I realized I hadn't seen any fresh footprints in a while. That's when it hit me. I was lost. My heart started to race. I'd always prided myself on my sense of direction, but now I felt completely turned around. I tried to think logically. If I kept heading downhill, I'd eventually reach the stream. From there, I could follow it back to the trail. It was a solid plan, but the longer I walked, the more doubts crept in. What if I'd misjudged the direction? What if the stream was farther away than I thought? An hour passed, then two. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows. My water bottle was half empty, and I'd already eaten most of my food. I tried to stay positive, but panic was creeping in around the edges. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my pulse quicken. I kept imagining someone or something watching me from the shadows. As the afternoon wore on, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. A pile of stones arranged in a neat circle, a tree with strange carvings on its bark. I told myself they were just the remnants of old campsites, but they felt wrong somehow, out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally found the stream just as the sun was beginning to set. Relief flooded through me. I knelt by the water's edge and splashed my face, savoring the coolness. I filled my bottle and drank deeply, trying to push away the lingering unease. But the relief didn't last long. The stream was wider than I'd expected, and its banks were steep and overgrown. Following it wasn't going to be as easy as I'd hoped. I had to push through thick underbrush, my arms and legs scratched by thorns. The light was fading fast, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. I knew I needed to find a place to camp, but nothing looked safe. The ground was uneven, and every shadow seemed to hide some unseen threat. I finally settled on a small clearing near the stream. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire, its flickering light a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual nighttime chorus of insects and frogs was oddly muted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving just beyond the edge of the light, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd jolt awake at the slightest sound. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to find the fire reduced to glowing embers. The forest was pitch black, and the air was deathly quiet. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like something knocking against a tree, came from somewhere up the hill, slow and deliberate.
Top, top, top.
I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. My first instinct was to grab my pack and run, but I forced myself to stay put. Running blindly through the woods at night would only make things worse. Instead, I stoked the fire, feeding it more wood until the flames flared back to life. The light pushed back the darkness, and the tapping stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the fire, every muscle in my body tense. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I packed up my gear and set off along the stream, determined to find the trail and get the hell out of there. Took me most of the morning, but I finally found it. The sight of that familiar dirt path nearly brought me to tears. I followed it back toward the trailhead, my steps quick and purposeful. I didn't stop to rest, didn't even look back. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the trunk and collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trees, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never did. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since. I still go hiking, but I stick to well-traveled trails now. I carry extra batteries for my GPS and make sure someone always knows where I'm going. But no matter how prepared I am, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are watching, waiting for me to slip up again. And next time, I might not be so lucky. I had been hiking for hours now, and the thick canopy above me made everything feel dim and suffocating. It was the kind of forest you see in old movies, dark, dense, and seemingly endless. I had read up on the trail before heading out. Supposedly, it was a quiet, scenic route. But now that I was deep in it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of damp earth was heavy in my nostrils. My feet squelched in the mud as I pressed on, the path narrowing and twisting like it had a mind of its own. Trees lined either side of me, their trunks towering high, moss clinging to their bark, twisting roots crawling across the ground. Felt like they were reaching out, trying to pull me deeper into the woods. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course, that's always how it goes. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but the thought of retracing my steps through the same winding trail felt worse. My body felt heavy, tired from the weight of the backpack and the day's hike, but I pressed forward. It was supposed to be an easy hike. What was I worried about? The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird chirping, faded. In their place, there was a low, almost imperceptible hum. Couldn't place it. It wasn't from the trees or the wind. It didn't belong here. I paused, looking around. The stillness felt unsettling. My breath quickened, but I brushed it off as nerves. Nothing to worry about, just keep going. The trail started to rise, and I climbed higher, the slope growing steeper with each step. My legs burned, my boots sinking into the soft dirt. Every so often, I'd pass a small clearing, but there was no sign of anyone else. I hadn't seen another hiker in hours. That in itself wasn't odd. The trail wasn't exactly popular, but it wasn't comforting either. After what felt like an eternity, the trail began to level off, and I could hear the faint sound of running water ahead. A stream, maybe. I pressed on, eager for a break. The forest started to open up a bit, the trees less dense. The sound of the stream grew louder, and soon enough, I came across it. A narrow, rocky creek, its water flowing clear and cold. I stopped for a moment, letting my feet rest, dipping my hand into the water. The coolness was a welcome relief against the heat of the day. I sat on a large rock by the edge of the stream, pulling out my water bottle and sipping. The forest still felt off, like something wasn't quite right. I had always enjoyed the solitude of hiking, the quiet, But today it was different. There was an unease in the air that I couldn't shake. I glanced around again. The trees were still, the only movement the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. But then I noticed something, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow. I turned my head quickly, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. The trees, the rocks, the creek, everything seemed normal, too normal. I shook my head. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired, hot, and a little too focused on the eerily quiet surroundings. No one else had come this way for a while, it seemed. That was all. I stood up and continued down the trail, following the stream as it wound its way through the woods. The trail was narrowing again, and I had to step carefully over rocks and roots. The sound of the creek was now constant, rushing beside me as I walked. My mind wandered back to the noise I thought I'd heard earlier. What was that hum? And why had the forest gone so quiet? It wasn't normal for everything to go silent like that. I reached a bend in the trail, the water running louder as I rounded the corner. But then I froze. Something was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it, but then it hit me. I was no longer hearing the creek. The sound had vanished. I stepped forward cautiously, looking around. The forest had grown unnaturally still. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, like the weight of the silence was pressing in on me. A flicker of movement caught my eye again, but this time, I wasn't imagining it. There, between the trees, I saw it, a figure. Someone standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trunks. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks again. But the feeling lingered, crawling under my skin, making my pulse race. The trail dipped down into a small hollow, and ahead of me, I saw a narrow bridge crossing over the creek. The water beneath it rushed in a way that sounded louder than before. I made my way toward the bridge, my footsteps quick and uneven, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I crossed the bridge quickly, the wooden planks creaking beneath my feet. Once across, I felt a brief sense of relief, but only for a moment. The eerie feeling remained, thick as ever. Then it happened. A loud snap, a twig breaking. Someone or something was behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming in my chest. The woods were empty, but I could feel it now. Someone was there. I could feel their presence, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows between the trees. I didn't wait around. Panic flooded me as I started to run, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the trees. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't care about the path anymore. I just needed to get away, to get back to where I'd come from. The trees seemed to close in on me as I ran. The air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and something unfamiliar, a metallic tang that I couldn't place. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the strain of running. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the ache in my chest. The trail stretched on endlessly, each step heavier than the last. I glanced back, half expecting to see something or someone following me, but there was nothing. The woods were still. I didn't know how much time had passed, but eventually, the trail began to widen. I slowed down, my body too exhausted to keep up the frantic pace. The dense forest had opened up into a clearing, and I saw the familiar outline of a cabin in the distance. A lone cabin, far from the main trail, tucked away at the edge of the forest. I stumbled toward it, hardly able to believe I had found it. The cabin wasn't much, a small, weather-beaten structure, but it meant safety. It meant a way out of this unnerving wilderness. I approached carefully, my mind still racing. The door was ajar, a thin crack of light spilling out into the darkening evening. I pushed it open slowly, and the sound of the hinges creaked in the silence. Inside was a simple room. No furniture, no sign of life, just dust and cobwebs. A long-forgotten shelter, it seemed, but it was shelter nonetheless. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, my heart slowly returning to normal. I'd made it. I leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. What had just happened? Was it the woods playing tricks on me? Had I imagined the figure? Had I been lost in the trees for too long? But as I stood there, breathing in the stillness, something caught my eye. A shape in the far corner of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, but as I looked closer, I saw it. Something was there. Someone, person, or what was left of one. I didn't scream, couldn't. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure was slumped against the wall, covered in dirt, eyes wide open. The body looked wrong, distorted. I didn't need to see any more. I backed out of the cabin, my legs shaking, my mind too scrambled to process what I had just found. I had to leave, had to get out of there. I ran. By the time I finally found my way back to the main trail, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the woods in a cloak of darkness. But the forest was no longer silent. I heard the distant sound of the creek again, the rustling of leaves, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. But this time I wasn't alone. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary when I booked the cabin. In fact, I thought it would be a simple, quiet getaway. Just me, the woods, and the isolation I had convinced myself I needed. I'd been working too hard, and the city felt suffocating. So when I stumbled across an ad for a secluded cabin in the woods, I thought it was perfect. A few days of peace, some fresh air, and time away from everything. Just what I needed. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The drive had taken longer than I'd expected. The winding roads through the forest seemed to get narrower and more overgrown the further I went, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting branches that hung too low. The trees felt almost suffocating, crowding the road like they were trying to swallow it whole. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in shadow. The place looked just like the pictures on the website, rustic and charming, with a stone chimney, a porch with an old rocking chair, and windows that seemed to peer out into the forest like eyes. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the front door. There was a small note taped to it. "Key is under the mat. Welcome to your getaway." I bent down to lift the mat and found the key just as promised. With a small sigh of relief, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of smell you get when something hasn't been used for a while. The place was a little more rustic than I had imagined, but it was cozy enough. A fireplace in the corner, a couple of mismatched chairs, a wooden dining table, and a small kitchen tucked off to the side. There were a few paintings on the walls, nothing particularly fancy, just landscapes and old black and white photos of nature. I set my bag down on one of the chairs, looked around, and then went straight for the kettle. I needed something hot after the long drive. As the water heated up, I wandered around, exploring the cabin. I opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch, which creaked under my weight. The woods stretched out before me, silent, still, and endless. There was something oddly unnerving about it. Maybe it was the silence, how thick it felt. Not a single bird call or rustle of leaves. The trees stood like sentinels, their dark silhouettes looming against the faint light of the setting sun. I shook off the unease and decided to unpack. As I opened the closet in the small bedroom, I noticed something strange. A worn leather journal, tucked behind a stack of old blankets. I pulled it out, curious, and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed with age, the writing faded but legible. It looked like someone had written it a long time ago. As I skimmed through the first few pages, I realized it was a log of sorts, documenting the person's time at the cabin. It was filled with mundane details: weather, activities, the occasional mention of neighbors, but towards the end, the tone shifted. The entries became erratic, almost frantic. The noise is getting worse. I hear footsteps outside, but no one is there. Sometimes I wake up to find the door slightly open, but I know I locked it before bed. _ I tried to leave today, but the path was blocked. Couldn't get through. It's like the trees moved. _ I stopped reading, a chill creeping up my spine. I quickly shoved the journal back into the closet, feeling like I just opened a door to something I wasn't supposed to see. The kettle whistled, and I tried to focus on something else. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the fire, and tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort that had started to settle in my chest. Night fell quickly. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the cabin creaked with every gust. The silence of the forest outside only made the sounds inside seem louder. I settled into bed, pulling the thick blankets up to my chin. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise, the wind, the shifting of the house, kept me awake, listening. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the house settling, just the trees swaying in the wind. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, there was something in the air, something wrong. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of scratching. I sat up quickly, heart pounding. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to claw its way into the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the front door. I didn't move at first, frozen by fear. The sound was too deliberate, too strange. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost like nails scraping across wood. I got out of bed, my hands shaking as I reached for the flashlight beside the bed. I crept toward the door, every step feeling like it echoed through the cabin. The scratching had stopped now, but I could still feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I hesitated, but then I forced myself to look out the window. Nothing, just the dark trees swaying in the wind. I exhaled, feeling foolish for letting my mind run wild. Maybe it was just a branch scraping against the house. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something strange. A shape moving in the shadows beyond the porch. It was tall, hunched over, and it wasn't moving like an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. I backed away from the window, my heart thudding in my chest. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just my mind playing tricks in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep much after that. The rest of the night passed in a haze of half-sleep and uneasy waking. Every small noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far. The next morning, I decided to leave. I couldn't take the feeling that something was wrong any longer. But when I went to pack my things, I noticed something. The front door was ajar. I knew I had locked it before bed. I was sure of it. And yet, here it was, slightly open, just enough for someone to slip in and out unnoticed. I felt the panic rise in my chest again. Had someone been inside? Had they been watching me all night? I grabbed my bag and hurried to the car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, not once. The trees seemed to close in around me, the road more claustrophobic than before. But I didn't stop. I drove until the cabin was a distant memory, the woods receding behind me. When I finally made it back to the main road, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe. The cabin was behind me, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the side of the road, Standing motionless in the trees was a figure. It was tall, hunched, just like the one I'd seen the night before, and it was watching me. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the quiet of the woods, away from the noise of the city. The cabin I rented was tucked deep in a forested area, miles from the nearest town. No cell signal, no distractions, just the sound of nature and time to relax. I thought it would be perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still high but beginning to dip behind the trees. The cabin looked older than the photos had shown. It was small, one story, with a sloping roof and thick, wooden beams that groaned in the wind. The porch had a swing, but the paint was chipped and faded. It was more rustic than I'd imagined, but that was okay. It added to the charm. I unpacked my things quickly. The place was musty inside, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. The windows were covered with thick curtains that I pushed aside, revealing the overgrown forest just outside. I felt a strange sense of calm mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first night was uneventful. I spent most of it reading and drinking wine in front of the fireplace. The crackling of the wood was comforting. I didn't even realize how tired I was until my eyelids grew heavy. I set down the book, blew out the candle on the table, and turned in for the night. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, but there was something about the silence that kept me awake longer than I expected. The usual sounds of wildlife outside, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, seemed distant. Everything felt strangely still, too still. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every little creak and groan in the house. At some point in the night, I heard something, a soft, tapping sound. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the window, but then it grew louder. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal either. The sound was deliberate, slow, like someone was gently tapping on the glass. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to get up and look outside. Maybe it was just a branch, I told myself. But the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as though it was waiting for something. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and pointed it toward the window. The beam of light cut through the dark, but I saw nothing outside. The forest was as still as it had been before. No movement, no shadows. I waited for the tapping to stop. It did, but that didn't put me at ease. The longer I lay there, the more I realized how unnervingly quiet it had become. Not even the wind stirred the trees. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. I turned over, pulling the covers tightly around me, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I went out for a walk to clear my head. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves slowly bringing me back to my senses. I explored a little beyond the cabin, taking in the sights of moss-covered trees and the occasional deer tracks. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue. It felt like the world was miles away from anything familiar, which was exactly what I wanted. That evening, I decided to cook dinner in the small kitchen of the cabin. There was a sense of calm now, and I was looking forward to settling in for the night. As I chopped vegetables, I thought about the tapping noise from the night before. I convinced myself it had just been an odd branch hitting the window. Nothing more. But then the lights flickered. I froze, knife still in hand. I turned to the overhead light, but it flickered again and then went out completely. I stood there in the dark for a moment, unsure of what to do. The house was so quiet again, except for the soft hum of the fridge in the corner. I walked to the fuse box, checked the circuit breakers, but everything seemed normal. I tried the light again, but it stayed off. Frustrated, I grabbed a few candles from a nearby shelf and lit them. The soft glow from the flames filled the cabin with a strange warmth, but the air still felt off. I shook the feeling away and finished making dinner by candlelight. After eating, I decided to take a walk around the perimeter of the cabin. I wanted to check the windows, maybe look for any signs of branches hitting the glass, anything that might explain the noises I'd heard. The sky was nearly dark now, and the trees surrounding the cabin cast long shadows across the yard. I circled the cabin twice, inspecting every window, every corner of the porch, but there was nothing. No branches brushing against the walls, no strange marks on the windows. Everything looked normal. The forest stretched out beyond, dark and silent. As I walked back to the front door, I noticed something strange. The swing on the porch was gently rocking back and forth. I hadn't touched it, and the wind wasn't strong enough to make it move. It was as if someone had just gotten off it and walked away. But the swing had been completely still when I walked around the house just moments earlier. I stood there, staring at it for a long time. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical reason for everything that had been happening. But there was no answer, only the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the tapping started again. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening, waiting. The sound began softly at first, just like before, but this time it didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic.
Top, top, top.
Over and over again, like something or someone was trying to get in. My pulse was racing. I grabbed the flashlight, but I didn't want to go to the window again. What if something was out there? I couldn't bring myself to look. I pulled the covers up to my chin and stared at the dark room, listening to the tapping that wouldn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped. There was nothing, just the stillness of the night. I had enough. The next morning, I packed my things, not bothering to eat breakfast. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. The tapping, the eerie silence, it was too much. I left the keys on the counter and locked the door behind me, stepping out into the cool morning air. As I drove away from the cabin, I felt a strange sense of relief. The tension in my chest finally began to loosen. But as I drove farther down the narrow dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for just a second, I could have sworn I saw the porch swing moving again. I didn't stop. When I finally made it to the nearest town, I stopped at the small diner to get some coffee. As I sat down at the counter, I couldn't help but overhear the conversation between the waitress and an older man sitting nearby. He was talking about the cabin I had rented. "I wouldn't go up there alone," he said, his voice low. "That place has a history. People say it's been abandoned for years, but sometimes people still go up there." I listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The waitress nodded, but I didn't catch the rest of the conversation. All I could think about was the cabin and the strange feeling I had left behind. When I finally asked the waitress about it, she just shook her head. "It's a place that's been around for a long time. People come and go, but no one ever stays long. There's a reason for that." I paid for my coffee and left the diner, the unease creeping back into my thoughts. But for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The night had already begun to creep in as I finished setting up the camp. The sun was sinking low, and the towering trees that surrounded me stretched their dark arms up to the sky. I could feel the cool breeze rustling through the leaves, the kind that makes the air smell earthy and fresh, yet it brought with it an unsettling sense of emptiness, the kind of silence that you only really notice when you're completely alone. I had decided to go camping by myself this time. I've always loved the outdoors, the simplicity of being surrounded by nature, away from the constant hum of city life. The campsite I had chosen was off the beaten path, a secluded spot near the edge of a forested area. I'd read reviews online about the place, and they all spoke of its beauty, peace, and most importantly, how quiet it was. I had planned to spend a couple of days out here, just to clear my head and disconnect from everything for a while. The forest was serene, the kind of place where you could imagine yourself for hours just listening to the sounds of wildlife. Birds calling, the wind in the trees, the faint rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But now, as the daylight faded, I felt something that wasn't quite right. The campfire crackled and popped in front of me as I sat on a log, warming my hands. I stared into the flames, almost hypnotized by their dance. The firelight flickered against the dark trees that surrounded the clearing, casting long, wavering shadows. I shifted on the log, glancing around. The place didn't feel as peaceful as I had expected. The air was still, and the quiet felt unnatural.
No birds. No insects.
Just silence. I brushed off the feeling. Maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, I had come out here for solitude, and that kind of quiet might be unsettling when you're not used to it. I decided to focus on the warmth of the fire and the smell of burning wood. But the longer I sat there, the more that feeling gnawed at me. I turned my attention back to the surroundings. I had a small tent set up just a few feet away from the fire, my gear neatly piled inside. The stars were starting to appear above, though the treetops made it difficult to see much of the sky. The sound of a twig snapping nearby caught my attention, making my heart skip a beat. I froze. My eyes scanned the darkening forest, but nothing moved. Probably just an animal, I muttered to myself, though I wasn't convinced. The fire crackled louder, sending a few sparks floating into the air. I stood up, deciding to check on the wood supply. I had brought enough for the night, but I didn't want to risk running out if the night turned colder than I expected. As I grabbed the bundle of firewood next to the tent, I felt it again, the sensation that I wasn't alone. It was subtle, a shift in the air, like someone was watching me. My skin prickled, and I looked around, but still, there was nothing. "Okay, calm down," I muttered, trying to shake off the paranoia. I added more logs to the fire and sat back down, trying to ignore the odd feeling creeping up my spine. The night had fully settled in by now, and it was darker than I thought it would be. The trees above blocked out most of the light from the stars, leaving the area in near total darkness except for the fire. I decided to eat, figuring the routine would help settle my nerves. I had packed a simple meal, canned beans, some bread, and a little jerky. It wasn't much, but it would do. The fire's warmth felt good against the chill of the air as I ate, my eyes constantly flicking toward the tree line. I felt like something was out there, just waiting for me to lower my guard. After dinner, I cleaned up quickly, eager to retire to my tent and get some sleep. I crawled inside, zipped up the entrance, and settled into my sleeping bag. The inside of the tent smelled faintly of nylon and campfire smoke, a combination that would normally be comforting. But tonight it wasn't. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind rustling the leaves outside, the occasional crackle from the fire. My mind wandered as I stared at the fabric of the tent above me. Was it the isolation? Was I just not used to being alone for long periods of time? The more I thought about it, the more I felt like something was wrong. The kind of wrong that wasn't easily explained. Then I heard it. A noise, faint but distinct. A slow, deliberate step. It was coming from just outside my tent. My heart slammed in my chest, and I held my breath. Another step, a little closer this time, and then another. My body tensed. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else. The worst part was how quiet it was. Even the wind had stopped. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Just silence and those slow, deliberate steps. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The steps circled the tent, always slow, always measured. They came to a stop just outside the flap of my tent. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick. I waited. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just an animal? A bear? Maybe. I'd heard stories of bears sniffing around campsites, but something about this felt different. This felt like someone was deliberately out there, watching me. The minutes dragged on. I must have laid there for hours, too afraid to fall asleep, too afraid to even breathe normally. The steps never came back. There was no sudden rustling of branches or anything that might indicate the presence of an animal. Everything remained still. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I must have fallen asleep despite myself, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of daylight filtering through the trees. The early morning light cast a soft glow on the ground, and the chill in the air had started to lift. My body ached from lying on the cold ground all night, but I was thankful for the light. I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside. The campsite was exactly as I had left it. Nothing disturbed, no sign of anyone or anything. I stood there for a moment, looking around. Everything looked calm, too calm. I forced myself to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It was probably an animal, I reasoned. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was thick with silence, and every little rustle of the trees or chirp of a bird made me jump. I quickly packed up my things and started to head out, deciding to cut my trip short. Whatever I had felt the night before, I didn't want to stay and find out what else might be lurking in those woods. As I walked back to my car, the hairs on the back of my neck still stood up. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, got in, and slammed the door shut. I didn't look back once as I started the engine and drove away. The road ahead seemed endless, the vast forest stretching on either side of me. I tried to calm myself, but the weight of the night still hung heavy on my chest. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe it was just the isolation. But deep down, I knew there was something I hadn't understood, something I didn't want to understand. That feeling never left me. Even now, as I sit here, writing this down, I can't shake the memory of those deliberate steps. I'm never going back out there. I've told myself it was probably nothing, but I can't help but wonder, was it an animal? Or was it something else? Something I'll never fully understand? I had always thought that being alone in the wilderness wouldn't be so bad. I mean, it's peaceful, right? The fresh air, the sound of nature, the absence of distractions. At least that's what I convinced myself of when I signed up for this solo camping trip. I had done it before, sure, but this time was different. I wasn't just heading into some well-traveled park. No, I chose a place far off the beaten path. The kind of place that made me feel like I was truly escaping everything. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a time to reset. But now, looking at the winding trail that led deeper into the woods, a strange sense of unease crept up on me. Something felt off. I tried to shake it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. That feeling you get when you're far from home, far from any sign of civilization. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail as I hiked deeper into the forest. The birds chirped, and the wind rustled through the trees. It was peaceful, just as I had imagined. I had packed my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and the essentials. I wasn't expecting any problems, at least not major ones. But there was something about this place that didn't sit right. Maybe it was how quiet it was. No sounds of animals, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The trail was narrow and winding, and the trees grew thicker around me, their gnarled roots protruding from the ground like twisted fingers. It was getting darker, and the temperature was dropping. I found a small clearing and decided it was as good a spot as any to set up camp for the night. I dropped my backpack to the ground and began unpacking. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The air felt heavier, thicker. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I dismissed it as nerves. The wind whispered through the leaves, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, no someone, moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I paused, holding my breath, but there was nothing, just the usual rustling of the wind. I laughed at myself. "You're just being paranoid," I muttered aloud. There was no one out here, just me, alone in the wilderness. But still, that sense of being watched lingered, pressing down on me. After a quick meal, I sat by the fire I'd built, the crackling flames providing a small comfort in the growing darkness. The warmth felt good against the chill in the air, and the smoke curled up into the sky, vanishing into the trees. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to relax, but the unease wouldn't go away. It was as if the silence was too thick, too complete. The forest felt empty in a way that was hard to describe. It was as though the usual sounds of wildlife had been muted, as if something was keeping them away. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Night settled in, and with it, the sounds of the forest became distant and strange. The wind was still, but the air was unnaturally cold, and I could feel it creeping into my bones. I retreated into my tent, zipping it up tightly. The rustling of the leaves outside had stopped, and the silence was overwhelming. Too quiet. I pulled the sleeping bag over me, but sleep wouldn't come. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a noise, like someone, moving outside the tent. The sound was soft, deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening intently. There it was again, the rustling of leaves, the crunch of twigs snapping underfoot. I held my breath, trying to control the panic rising in my chest. Could just be an animal, I reasoned. But why did it feel so deliberate, so human? I reached for the flashlight by my side and slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the blackness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the quiet. I stayed up for hours, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to make any noise. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept my flashlight within reach, my hand on the handle, ready to shine it at the slightest disturbance. But nothing happened. The forest was still. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep out of sheer need. I woke up the next morning with the light of dawn streaming through the trees. I was stiff, my body sore from lying in a strange position all night. But the first thing that hit me wasn't physical pain, it was the silence. The eerie, oppressive silence that greeted me when I unzipped the tent. The usual birds weren't chirping. There was no hum of insects, no sounds of small animals in the underbrush. The wind wasn't even stirring the branches. It was as though the world had stopped turning. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. I didn't want to stay here any longer than necessary. Something felt wrong. Something had been wrong last night, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. I hiked back down the trail, moving faster than usual, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the forest felt different. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in on me, the trail narrowing with every step I took. The air seemed heavier, as though the trees were pressing down on me. It was harder to breathe, and my chest felt tight, my heart racing as if urging me to run. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, but that only made the dread settle deeper into my stomach. I had to stop and take a breath. My mind was playing tricks on me, my imagination running wild. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached a fork in the trail, a point where I knew I should have seen the main path leading back to my car. But when I looked, the trail ahead seemed unfamiliar, as if it had changed overnight. I couldn't make sense of it. My heart skipped a beat. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, I was sure this was the way I'd come. But the more I looked, the more I doubted myself. The trees looked different, the ground uneven in a way I didn't remember. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible, hidden by the shadows. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as my heart pounded in my ears. For a split second, I thought it was just another figment of my imagination. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping out from behind a tree. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the forest, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them on me, piercing through the dark. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my body locked in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. He just stood there, watching me. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I waited, holding my breath, my body shaking. The sound of my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before I could move again. When I finally managed to take a step forward, I ran. I ran like I had never run before, not looking back, not caring where I was going, just away. I don't know how long I ran or how far I went, but eventually, I stumbled out of the woods and onto a dirt road. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization, a house in the distance. I walked there, my legs trembling, my body covered in sweat despite the chill. I didn't stop to talk to anyone. I didn't need to. I just needed to be away, to be around people again where it was safe. I made my way to the nearest town, checked into a motel, and spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I still don't know what happened that day in the woods. Was it a person? A figment of my imagination? I'll never know. But one thing is for sure, I'll never go back to those woods again. And maybe, just maybe, some places are meant to stay untouched. That feeling, the dread, the silence, the sensation of being watched, has never really left me. It lingers like a shadow, always just out of sight. And as much as I try to ignore it, I can't help but feel that something is still out there, waiting. But I'm done looking. I've always preferred solitude. There's something about being away from people, surrounded only by nature and your thoughts, that feels right. I grew up in a small town, and even though I moved to the city a few years ago for work, I always found a way to return to the familiar silence of the woods whenever I could. Something about it calms me, makes me feel at peace in a way nothing else can. So, when I had a few days off, I decided to take a solo trip into the woods again. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. Just me, my backpack, and the untouched wilderness. No phone signal, no distractions. I've done this countless times before without issue. But this time, things felt different from the moment I stepped off the trail and into the woods. I parked my car at the base of the mountain, where the road turns into a narrow dirt path. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I checked my bag again, making sure I had everything I might need. A tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a map, a flashlight, and extra batteries. The essentials. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and I started walking deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't difficult, but it was steep in some places, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long and stretched across the ground like dark fingers. I wasn't worried, this was my element. I was used to it, I walked for hours, enjoying the quiet, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call. I had a general sense of where I was going, a small clearing about 5 miles in that I loved camping at. But as the light began to fade, I started to realize something strange. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the entire place had quieted down for some reason. Even the wind, which usually rustled through the branches, was eerily still. I checked my watch, it was getting late. I knew I wasn't far from the clearing, but something about the atmosphere felt off. I quickened my pace, but the stillness seemed to follow me. The further I went, the more uncomfortable I became. The woods felt too empty. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was a small, flat area with a ring of trees surrounding it, and it always felt safe, like it was a place where the outside world couldn't reach me. I set up my tent quickly, barely noticing the cold or the quiet anymore. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness had settled in completely. I lit my lantern, then sat outside for a while, staring into the flickering flame. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant rustling in the trees. I thought it was just the wind picking up, so I ignored it. But the rustling didn't stop. It got louder, like something was moving through the woods, heading in my direction. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was walking through the underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The woods were supposed to be empty. No one came out here this deep into the wilderness, especially not at night. I was sure of that. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but trees, their tall, dark shapes looming in the distance. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a person, or at least it looked like one, emerged from the trees. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped, almost as if it wasn't fully standing upright. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the silhouette of someone moving slowly toward me. The flashlight's beam bounced off the figure's form, but it didn't seem to illuminate it fully. It was as though the light couldn't reach it, or it absorbed the light instead. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? But there was something strange about the way it moved, unnatural, stiff, like it was dragging its legs behind it. And the way it was slowly approaching, it wasn't like someone walking toward me. It was deliberate, methodical, like it had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept into my mind. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any noise except for the sound of its footsteps. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. My mind raced. It was too far to run, and I wasn't about to make the first move toward it. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but there was a gut feeling telling me not to approach. I backed up slowly, then turned and bolted toward my tent. My breath was sharp, ragged in my chest as I scrambled to get inside, fumbling with the zipper as my hands shook uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to get it shut. I collapsed against the side of the tent, heart racing, every muscle tense. Outside, the figure didn't follow immediately. I listened, trying to hear any sounds. Footsteps, breathing, but it was silent. Too silent. The only sound was the rush of blood in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight again, but as I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, I found nothing. The clearing was empty. I waited. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. There was no way that figure had just disappeared. Then I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the trees. But this time I could see it clearly. It was a man, at least it looked like a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight at me. His expression was blank, emotionless, as if he wasn't aware of me, but at the same time, he was staring directly at me. I froze again, unable to move, unsure if I should scream or run. I thought about reaching for my phone, but I realized it wasn't in my bag. My heart hammered, my breath shallow and fast. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop staring into those dark, empty eyes. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange urge to follow him. A sick curiosity clawed at me, urging me to leave the safety of my tent and venture into the dark forest after him. But I didn't. I stayed put, frozen in place. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. The woods were empty again, just as they should have been. The sun rose over the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to enjoy the usual calm of the morning. I didn't feel safe anymore, and I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. I made my way back down the trail, trying to ignore the strange feeling of being followed, of something watching me just out of sight. It wasn't until I reached my car and started driving back toward the town that I felt like I could breathe again. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something move in the woods behind me. I never went back to that place. Maybe I'll never understand what happened, but I don't need to. Some things are better left unexplained. All I know is that the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes there are things out there that don't belong. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought the weekend getaway to the cabin would be the perfect escape. Just a few days away from the noise of the city, a chance to relax and get some peace. The idea of nature, the mountains, and the isolation sounded ideal. I rented the cabin online, and I didn't think much about it. The photos showed a cozy, rustic place nestled deep in the woods, far enough from town to feel remote, but not so far that you couldn't get help if needed. The reviews were positive enough, quiet and peaceful. A great place to unwind. Perfect if you want to disconnect. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, following the GPS directions. The road became less paved the closer I got to the cabin. I could feel the car bouncing along the uneven terrain, and the trees around me started to grow thicker. The air smelled different here, cleaner, almost crisp, but also a little earthy. Something familiar, something wild. When I arrived, I saw the cabin for the first time. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. A small wooden structure with a porch that wrapped around the front. It was nestled against a hill, surrounded by trees that seemed to go on forever. There was no one around, not even other cabins nearby. Just a peaceful, quiet emptiness. It felt isolated, but not in a threatening way, at least not yet. I unloaded my things into the cabin and took in my surroundings. The inside was just as cozy as it appeared in the photos. Old wooden beams, a stone fireplace, mismatched furniture, and a large window at the back that looked out over a small creek. It was charming, no doubt about that. But the more I looked around, the more I realized how remote this place truly was. No neighbors, no cell service, no Wi-Fi. Just me, a few trees, and the sounds of birds and wind. I started a fire in the fireplace and settled into one of the chairs. I unpacked my bag, put on some music to fill the silence, and just let myself sink into the atmosphere. I was looking forward to having the whole weekend to myself. It was going to be great. The first evening passed uneventfully. I made dinner, read a book, and went to bed early, enjoying the feeling of being away from the world. But something strange happened as I lay there, drifting off to sleep. There was a noise. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper on the wind. I strained to hear it, unsure if it was just my imagination or something else. But then it became clearer, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it. It was coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the sound of tree branches scraping against the walls in the wind. But this was different. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the woods. I peered out into the dark, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, just the shadows of branches swaying gently. The tapping stopped. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe the house was settling. I convinced myself that it was nothing, so I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. But the tapping didn't stop there. The next morning, I woke up early and had breakfast by the fire. I spent the day outside, hiking through the woods, enjoying the solitude. There was a quiet beauty to the landscape, the way the trees stood tall and still, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. It was peaceful, and it allowed me to let go of the stress that had built up in my life. For a while, it felt like everything was right, but by that evening, the feeling had shifted. I couldn't quite explain why, but there was something off about the cabin now. It wasn't the noise from the night before, though that still lingered in the back of my mind. It was more the air, the way the trees seemed to grow thicker as the light started to fade. The shadows felt longer, darker, and the silence, there was something unnerving about it. The wind had stopped, the birds had stopped singing, and it felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I tried to ignore the unease that was creeping up on me, so I decided to take another walk. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my skin, and I breathed deeply, trying to clear my head. The sky was turning dark, the stars slowly emerging in the vastness above. I started walking toward the creek, hoping the sound of running water would calm my mind. But as I approached the water, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the edge of the creek. It wasn't human, not really. It was too still, too rigid, and the way it stood with its back to me made my skin crawl. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its arms were stretched out at an odd angle, almost like it was reaching for something that I couldn't see. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at this thing. I tried to tell myself that it was just a tree or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took a step back, slowly, trying not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter, but before I could take another step, the figure turned. It wasn't a person, at least not in any way I could understand. Its face was a twisted mess, like something that had been half-formed and left to decay. The skin was pale and stretched too tight, its eyes black holes that seemed to absorb all light. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just a horrible, gurgling noise. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. My feet were clumsy, stumbling over rocks and branches as I sprinted back toward the cabin. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel it, whatever that thing was, following me, getting closer with each step. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing against me, trying to drag me down. My heart pounded in my chest, and I thought for sure I wouldn't make it back. But somehow I did. I burst through the door of the cabin, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, breathless and shaking. I checked the locks, all of them, and then I sat on the floor, trying to calm myself down. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? Was it just the isolation playing tricks on me? But the feeling, the fear, those were real. I knew what I had seen. That night, the tapping returned. I tried to block it out, to ignore it, but it was no use. It was louder now, closer. Came from all directions. The roof, the walls, the windows. It was like the cabin itself was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of the tapping. I could hear it even through the thick walls, tapping and scraping, like fingers dragging along the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and made a decision. I was leaving. I didn't care what time it was. I didn't care how far the drive was. I just needed to get out of there. As I started the car, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The windows were dark, but I swear I saw something moving in the shadows. I didn't wait to find out what it was. The road felt endless as I drove, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. It was late, but I found a small motel and checked in. The woman behind the counter looked at me strangely, but I didn't care. I just needed a bed, some peace. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Couldn't. They wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw, and I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't know what was out there, but I know it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could explain. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night trying to sleep, I can still hear the tapping. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It's out there. I never should have gone on that hike alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my boots, and the mountains. I had been planning it for weeks, thinking that some solitude in the wild would be the perfect escape from the stress of work and city life. I chose a trail that wasn't too well known, the kind of place where you could feel like you were the only person on Earth, the perfect way to recharge. The morning I left, the weather was clear, a bit chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. The trailhead was just off the main road, and as I parked my car, I was met with the usual mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with starting something new. I checked my pack one more time, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map. I knew the trail, at least the general layout of it, so I didn't expect to get lost. Still, I always like to be prepared. I locked the car and set off, breathing in the fresh, crisp air. The trail started out easy, winding through thick trees, their leaves already starting to turn amber for the fall. The air smelled earthy, like damp soil and pine. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the gravel path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few miles were nothing unusual. The trail dipped down into a small valley, following a creek that twisted through the trees. It was quiet, with just the sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird call overhead. I stopped a few times to take pictures, admiring the landscape, but each time I looked around, something seemed off. The woods felt dense, too dense. The trees crowded in on me, their gnarled branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. I shrugged it off, though. It was just my imagination, I thought. About halfway through the hike, the trail became steeper, leading up toward a rocky ridge. I had read that the view from the top was breathtaking, and that's what kept me going. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I welcomed the physical challenge. I was in good shape, and this was exactly what I needed to clear my head. That's when I noticed something strange. I'd been walking for hours, and the trail was starting to feel unfamiliar. The path was narrowing, becoming more overgrown. The usual trail markers were sparse, and I started to wonder if I had missed a turn somewhere. I checked my map, but it didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. The contours of the land were wrong. I couldn't figure it out. I stood there for a moment trying to get my bearings. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of nature dimming as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to press on, hoping the trail would open up again. But it didn't. It just got worse. The path became more and more difficult to follow, the ground uneven and slippery from the morning dew. I found myself scrambling over rocks and fallen branches, my heart rate picking up as the trail seemed to disappear entirely. At this point, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. It was as if the forest had closed in around me, trapping me in a maze with no way out. I should have turned back then. The thought crossed my mind, but something kept me going. Maybe it was the idea of the view at the top, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I had gotten myself into a situation I couldn't handle. I kept moving, pushing through the underbrush and ignoring the creeping sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. There was something else, something wrong. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a cliff, the rocks jutting out sharply toward the sky. It was a view, but not the one I had been expecting. The mountain peak was still out of reach, and the dense forest stretched endlessly behind me. The silence was oppressive, and it was as though the entire world had stopped. I looked around, trying to get a sense of where I was, but everything seemed unfamiliar. That's when I realized I had made a mistake. I'd taken the wrong path. Somehow, I had wandered off the main trail into an area that was rarely visited. I had no idea how far I had gone or where I was in relation to the trailhead. My phone had no signal, of course. I felt a wave of panic rush over me. This wasn't just a misturn or a minor detour. I was lost, and worse, I was alone. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a cold, golden light. The woods felt different in the fading light, darker, more threatening. I knew I had to get out of there before it got completely dark, but the thought of retracing my steps felt impossible. The trail was barely visible now, and with every step I took, the dense forest seemed to swallow me whole. I started moving again, hoping to find some sign of the trail or any recognizable landmarks. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I tried to remember my surroundings, any distinctive features of the landscape that might help me find my way back, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. Nothing stood out. I began to feel the weight of panic rising in my chest. My heart was pounding in my ears. I couldn't keep moving like this. I needed to stop and think. I found a small clearing and sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing. I pulled out my map again, but it was useless. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted, become something I didn't recognize. As the light faded, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the chill of the night air sank into my bones. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay put and hope someone would come looking for me, or keep moving and risk getting even more lost. I opted for the latter. Felt like my only option. I picked a direction and forced myself to walk. The darkness pressed in on me like a weight, and I stumbled over roots and rocks in the growing gloom. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a ghost or some supernatural presence. It was just the primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. Couldn't explain it, but I felt it deeply. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a light. It was faint at first, just a small glow in the distance, but it was enough to give me hope. I hurried toward it, my legs burning, my breath shallow and fast. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire or someone else's flashlight. It was the last remnants of daylight, barely visible through a break in the trees. And just beyond that break, I saw the trail. A small sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the turnoff to the main trail. I followed it without hesitation, my legs shaky but driven by the overwhelming need to get out of the woods. I kept my focus on the trail, ignoring the growing darkness around me, until finally, after what felt like hours, I made it back to the main path. Relief flooded through me, so intense that it almost brought me to my knees. I looked around, the familiar trees and rocks no longer feeling ominous but like old friends. I knew exactly where I was now. The end of the trail was just a few miles away. By the time I reached the trailhead, the stars were out, and the night air was crisp and cool. My car was waiting for me, a beacon of safety. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just got in, started the engine, and drove off without another thought. I don't know what exactly happened out there, but I know I'll never go hiking alone again. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how easily you can become lost in a place that's supposed to be peaceful. That forest isn't some tranquil escape. It's a place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. And as I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my head. I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. I'll never forget the day I decided to take the back roads. It was one of those rash decisions you make when you're fed up with the mundane and looking for some kind of adventure, though I wasn't exactly expecting the kind I got. I'd been driving cross-country for hours, trying to make my way back home after a family visit that stretched too long. I'd promised myself I'd avoid highways this time, just to see more of the country. A few hours into the trip, I found myself on a narrow, two-lane road that didn't even show up on my GPS. That should have been the first warning sign, but I was too stubborn to turn back. The road was bordered by thick woods on both sides, tall pines and oaks casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. Every so often, the trees would part just enough to reveal rolling fields or the occasional dilapidated barn. I kept driving, confident that the road would eventually lead to a main route. But the miles stretched on, and the road seemed to grow narrower, winding deeper into what felt like the middle of nowhere. The first real sign of trouble came when I noticed my gas gauge dipping dangerously close to empty. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier. I hadn't passed a gas station in hours, and there was no sign of civilization anywhere. I told myself I'd find something soon. There had to be a town or at least a house somewhere up ahead. But the road just kept going, the trees closing in tighter, the light fading faster. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was running on fumes. I turned off the AC to conserve gas and cracked a window. The cool evening air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, but it did little to calm my nerves. My phone had lost service hours ago, and I hadn't seen another car in just as long. Then, just as my gas light started blinking, I spotted a small dirt road branching off to the right. There was a rusty metal sign half hidden in the undergrowth, but the lettering was too faded to read. I slowed down, debating whether to take it. The road didn't look promising, but at that point I didn't have much of a choice. I turned onto the dirt path, my tires crunching over gravel and twigs. It was even narrower than the main road, with low-hanging branches that scraped against the roof of my car like skeletal fingers. After about a mile, I saw a faint light through the trees. Relief washed over me. A house, maybe? Or a cabin? I'd take anything at this point. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just one light but several, scattered across what looked like a cluster of small buildings. It wasn't a town exactly, but it was something. I pulled up to what appeared to be a general store. The building was old, the wood weathered and gray, with a sagging roof and a single flickering bulb above the entrance. There were a few other structures nearby, a couple of houses, a barn, and what looked like a workshop, but no cars, no people, no movement. The place felt abandoned, yet the light above the store suggested otherwise. I killed the engine and stepped out, the sound of my door slamming echoing in the stillness. The air was colder now, and the silence was oppressive. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. I walked up to the store, the wooden porch creaking under my weight. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated. Something about the place felt off, but I was desperate. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves stocked sparsely with canned goods, dusty bottles, and miscellaneous items. A small counter sat at the back, but there was no sign of a cashier. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. No answer. I walked up to the counter, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. A bell sat on the counter, so I gave it a tap. The sharp ding rang out, and then silence again. I waited, glancing around the store. There was a strange smell in the air, something metallic and sour. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make me uneasy. After a few more minutes of waiting, I decided to look around outside. Maybe whoever ran the place was in one of the nearby buildings. I stepped back onto the porch and scanned the area. The barn was the closest structure, its doors slightly open. I walked over, the gravel crunching under my boots. The barn was dark inside, but I could make out the shapes of tools hanging on the walls and bales of hay stacked in the corner. It didn't look like anyone had been there recently. As I turned to leave, I noticed something glinting in the moonlight near the edge of the barn. I walked over and saw a row of cars parked haphazardly in the grass, partially hidden by the tree line. There were at least 6 or 7 of them, all in varying states of decay. Some had flat tires, others were covered in rust, and a few looked like they'd been there for decades. My stomach sank. Why would there be so many abandoned cars here? I backed away, my pulse quickening. Something about this place wasn't right. I decided to head back to my car and keep driving, gas or no gas. As I walked back toward the store, I noticed a faint sound in the distance. A low, rhythmic thumping. It was faint but unmistakable, like the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. I froze, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from behind one of the houses. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept toward the house, keeping to the shadows. The sound grew louder as I approached, and I could make out a faint light coming from one of the windows. I peered around the corner of the house and saw a figure moving in the yard. It was a man, his back to me, dragging what looked like a large, heavy bag across the ground. The bag left a dark trail behind it, and my stomach turned as I realized what it might be. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. I made it back to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. "Come on," I whispered, turning the key again. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, backing out onto the dirt road. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing in the middle of the road, watching me. He didn't move, didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, silhouetted against the faint glow of the store's light. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the gas gauge well past empty. Eventually, the road led me to a small town, where I found a gas station and filled up. I told the attendant about the place I'd found, but he just gave me a blank look. "Ain't nothing out that way," he said. "Just woods." I didn't argue. I just paid for my gas and got back on the road, sticking to the highways this time. I've thought about that place a lot since then, about the man and the cars and the dark trail leading from that bag. I don't know what I stumbled into that night, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I'll never take the back roads again. I had always been someone who needed to escape into the wild, to get away from the noise of the world. The idea of hiking alone in the mountains always felt like the perfect way to clear my mind. I'd done it countless times before, but this time something felt different. It wasn't just the usual thrill of adventure, the expectation of solitude or the beauty of nature. It was something else, something nagging at the back of my mind. I woke up early, packed my bag with the essentials: water, snacks, first aid kit, a map of the trail, and of course, a flashlight. I made sure my boots were tightly laced up and double-checked the straps of my backpack to ensure everything was secure. My plan was simple: take the trail up, enjoy the peace, and head back down by nightfall. The air was cool, fresh with a crispness that signaled the start of autumn. I parked my car at the trailhead just as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. The trail stretched before me, wide and inviting, winding up into the thick forest. I could hear the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of birds in the distance. I was used to the sounds of the woods, but something about today felt off. The air seemed heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. The first few miles were easy, a steady climb through the woods, the path well-marked and clear. My pace was slow but steady, my feet crunching against the loose gravel beneath the dirt trail. The sun crept higher, dappling the path with patches of warm light, and I breathed in deeply, savoring the tranquility. It was exactly what I needed. As I moved further up, I noticed fewer and fewer signs of other hikers. It was a popular trail, but by now I hadn't passed a single person. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they had taken a different path, or perhaps they had started their hikes earlier. Still, there was a strange emptiness to the forest now, a quiet that went beyond the usual stillness of nature. The path began to narrow as I moved deeper into the mountains. The trees around me thickened, their branches intertwining above, blocking out most of the sun. Shadows deepened, and the air grew cooler. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to dismiss it. I was alone in the woods, that was the point, right? To be alone with my thoughts, away from the noise and distractions of everyday life. I pushed on, my footsteps growing louder in the silence. I glanced down at my watch. It had been about 2 hours since I started. I was beginning to feel the weight of my pack, but I didn't want to turn back yet. The view from the top was said to be spectacular, and I was determined to see it for myself. I pressed forward. Around a bend, the trail suddenly grew steeper. I could see the first hints of the rocky outcrop that marked the last stretch of the hike. The trees thinned, and the ground beneath my feet became uneven. It was a difficult climb, but nothing I couldn't handle. I took it slow, placing each foot carefully as I ascended. The higher I climbed, the more unsettled I felt. There was a strange quiet in the air, an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the lack of other hikers, it was something more. The sound of the wind, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves. It all seemed muffled, like I was in a vacuum. I paused for a moment to catch my breath, taking in the view. The valley below stretched out, a patchwork of greens and browns, the distant peaks just barely visible through the haze. It was beautiful, but something about the scene didn't feel right. I felt like I was being watched, but when I glanced around, there was nothing but trees and rocks. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. It was just my imagination running wild. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times before, and I'd never had this feeling. But as I continued to climb, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Then I saw it. Just off the trail, barely visible through the trees, was something that didn't belong. A campfire. It was small, the smoke rising lazily into the air, but it was the wrong place for a campfire. There was no campsite nearby, no clearing, no sign of anyone. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. Was someone else hiking this trail? Or had someone set up camp here without permission? Curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously made my way off the trail, moving toward the fire. The crackling sound of the flames seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, and with each step I took, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few moments, but there was no one there, just the trees. The fire was small, contained within a ring of rocks. The ground around it was untouched, not a single footprint marking the earth. I squatted down, my hand brushing the edge of the fire pit. The stones were cold, and the fire was nothing more than a few embers, barely smoldering. It hadn't been used for hours, maybe even longer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I looked around again, the unease I'd been feeling earlier now turning into full-blown anxiety. I stood up quickly, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn back, I noticed something strange on the ground. A small, weathered backpack, half hidden behind a boulder. It was an old one, the fabric faded and frayed, with a few items scattered around it. My stomach twisted as I looked at the backpack. Something about it felt wrong. It was too out of place. I walked closer, my footsteps hesitant, my mind racing. I crouched down, carefully lifting the backpack. It was heavy, filled with something. I opened it, my fingers trembling. Inside were a few things that made my heart stop. A flashlight, a map that had been torn and crumpled, and a small notebook, its pages filled with frantic scribbles. I quickly put the backpack down, my mind racing. Someone had been here recently. Someone had left in a hurry, or maybe they'd never intended to come back. But where were they now? Why had they left all this behind? Suddenly, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and I heard a distant sound, like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was eerily quiet, and the noise seemed out of place. I stood there for a few moments, straining to hear more, but all I could hear was the wind. I looked around, my instincts screaming at me to leave. I turned on my heel and rushed back to the trail, my pace quickening as I tried to push away the mounting dread. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I climbed higher, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with each step. The last stretch to the summit was grueling, but I finally made it. The view was stunning, just as promised. I could see the whole valley laid out before me, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in rays that bathed the mountains in a golden glow. But I didn't feel awe or peace. I felt nothing but relief. Relief that I had made it, and that I had put some distance between myself and whatever was lurking down the mountain. I sat on a rock at the top, taking in the view, but my mind kept returning to the campfire and the abandoned backpack. I knew I couldn't ignore what had happened. There was something wrong, something I couldn't explain. But for now, the only thing I could do was stay on the summit, breathe deeply, and wait until I had enough courage to head back down. As the sun began to set, I gathered my things, ready to make my way back. The way down was less challenging than the climb up, but it was still nerve-wracking. The same feeling of being watched crept up on me again, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was no one there, just the trees, just the silence. When I finally reached the trailhead again, I felt a deep sense of relief. The car was just where I had left it, parked in the same spot. I tossed my backpack in the trunk, got in, and slammed the door shut. The moment I started the engine, the weight in my chest lifted. I drove home, my mind still reeling. I couldn't explain what had happened up there, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been in the forest that day wasn't something I wanted to meet again. It was supposed to be a simple hike, just a couple of miles on a familiar trail, an afternoon of peace, and some quiet time alone in the woods. But things went wrong, as they often do when you least expect it. I remember the morning clearly, the sun barely breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp, with the scent of pine and earth. I was wearing my favorite boots, the ones that had seen a lot of trails, and I had packed light, a bottle of water, some snacks, a map, and a small first aid kit. The kind of essentials you don't think you'll need, but always bring just in case. I knew the trail well. It was one I'd hiked several times before, a path that wound through thick woods and led to a small, quiet lake. It wasn't supposed to be hard to follow, but something about that day felt different. First, the hike went smoothly. The sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots made the whole experience peaceful. I was focused on putting one foot in front of the other, keeping my mind clear. The kind of hike where you just let your thoughts wander and don't pay much attention to anything around you, trusting the trail to take you where you need to go. But somewhere along the way, I must have lost track of the path. I didn't notice it at first. Maybe it was the way the light shifted in the trees, or maybe it was the quiet, the absence of usual forest sounds like distant animals or the wind in the leaves. It was still, unnervingly still. I stopped and looked around, trying to remember the last clear landmark. I knew I hadn't wandered too far off the trail, but the woods here were dense, and the underbrush thick. The path had become less obvious, the ground beneath my feet more uneven. A glance at my watch told me it had been over an hour since I'd last checked the time. I should have reached the lake by now. I pulled out the map, my fingers trembling a bit as I unfolded it. It was supposed to be simple, straightforward. But the more I looked at the map, the more confused I became. The trail seemed to have disappeared, and the landmarks weren't matching up with what I was seeing in front of me. That's when the panic started to creep in, just a little at first. It's strange how it can happen without you even noticing. The shift from calm to uncertainty. You start second-guessing every step, every turn you made. I decided to keep going, hoping I'd find something familiar. My pace quickened as I pushed deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, and the shadows seemed to stretch further. It felt like the woods were closing in on me, trapping me in their quiet maze. I had no idea how long I'd been walking, but it felt like hours. The sky overhead had started to dim, the sunlight weakening as if it too had given up on trying to pierce the thick canopy. By then, my mind was racing. I thought of my phone, but I couldn't find it. I checked my pockets, my backpack. Nothing. My heart started to race. That was when I realized I had no way of contacting anyone. The thought of being completely alone in the woods with no way out was enough to make the panic swell inside me. But there was no turning back now. I had to keep going. I had to find a way out. Hours turned into what felt like days. I walked in circles, retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. The trees, the underbrush, the uneven terrain. My legs were starting to ache, my stomach growling with hunger. I had a granola bar in my pack, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. I felt nauseous, disoriented, as though the forest itself was somehow messing with my sense of time and space. I started to shout, not for help, there was no one around, but because I needed to hear my own voice. It felt like I was slipping into a quiet, suffocating kind of madness, and I needed something, anything, to break the silence. But the only response was the sound of my own voice echoing back at me, swallowed by the vast, empty woods. Nightfall came fast. The sky darkened to a deep, bruised purple, and I could hear the distant calls of animals, though nothing near enough to make me feel safer. The forest, once so serene, now felt like a maze designed to trap me. I could see nothing beyond the small circle of light from my flashlight, which flickered and dimmed with every step I took. I had to conserve the battery, but it was hard to ignore how much darker it got with each passing hour. I found a small clearing and decided to make camp. It wasn't much, a few dry logs and some leaves to sit on, but I had to rest. My body was exhausted, and my mind was spinning. I huddled under my jacket and tried to calm myself. I told myself I would figure this out. I just needed to get some sleep and wait for morning. Sleep didn't come easily, though. The cold of the night crept into my bones, and every sound in the forest seemed to amplify. Branches cracking in the distance, the scurrying of small animals, the rustle of leaves. My thoughts kept circling back to the same idea. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. No one knew where I was. It was just me, surrounded by miles of forest, with no clear way out. I don't know how long I lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness. But when the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a small surge of hope. I was still alive. I hadn't been swallowed by the forest. The sun was weak, just barely peeking through the branches, but it was enough to give me the strength to get up and keep moving. I forced myself to take deep breaths, to steady my shaking hands, and to push forward. I knew that panicking would only make things worse. The trail, or what had once been a trail, seemed more elusive than ever. Every step felt like I was going deeper into the unknown. I had to make a choice: keep going or sit down and wait for someone to find me. But sitting there wasn't an option. I had to keep going. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A break in the trees, a small clearing, and beyond that, light. Real, golden sunlight pouring through the trees. Couldn't believe it. I ran, stumbling, tripping over roots and rocks, but I didn't care. I pushed through, my heart racing, and when I finally broke through the dense woods, I saw the road. A small, dirt road, the kind you only find in the middle of nowhere. It was real, and it was the thing I needed to see. I dropped to my knees, exhausted and overwhelmed. I had found my way out. I wasn't lost anymore, and even though I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town, I knew I would make it. Someone would come by eventually. I wasn't alone. I wasn't lost forever. It was hours before a car came down that road, and I waved my arms frantically. The driver stopped, and I could barely form the words to explain what had happened. I was still in shock, still processing the fact that I had made it out. The driver offered me a ride, and I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the car, my body shaking from exhaustion, and the car started moving down the road, back to civilization. The relief I felt when I finally made it home was overwhelming. It was like I had been holding my breath the entire time, and now I could finally exhale. I was safe. I had been lost, yes, but I had found my way back. And as I sat there, staring out the window, I realized something. The forest wasn't just a place to get lost in. It was also a place to find yourself again.